Jordan, I would like to thank you for the invitation to be here tonight, and Hearn for the introduction, and I thank all of you for taking the time to come out this evening. The talk tonight is entitled A Technology and Method for Expansion of Awareness and Spiritual Growth. And one of the themes that we're going to address is how an increase in spirituality leads to an increase in optimal functioning, the kind that wins blue ribbons. And here we are at the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library Symposium, Ashland, Oregon, April 1st. The purpose. I'd like to begin with some of the library's purpose. It is the library's philosophy that our ability to discern truth is enhanced by exposure to a broad perspective on the human experience. As we integrate new truths into our awareness, the expansion of knowledge in the collective mind advances. This is the evolution of human consciousness. Okay, so the evolution of human consciousness in alpha. By improving self-control of our brain states, we dramatically improve our abilities to operate at optimal levels of mental, spiritual, and physical activity. If we have increase of spirituality, we have an increase of scholarship and intellectual ability, we have an increase in the ability to open our hearts, and we have optimal functioning. As Hearn read in the introduction, the means of achieving spiritual growth are well known. They are quieting the mind, stilling the internal dialogues, and opening our hearts. And as we all know, this is much easier to say than to do. Albert Einstein said that problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them. So obviously, if we want to solve problems quickly, easily, and effectively, we need to shift our awareness and go to, ideally, a higher level of awareness. If you go to a lower level of awareness, you can solve problems, but sometimes not in the most productive way. For example, if something is stuck, you can take a sledgehammer and break it, and then it's no longer stuck. That's going to a lower level of awareness in order to solve the problem. Now, the topics in tonight's talk are broken down into two general areas. In part one, we're going to look at the role of beliefs, distractions, or negative mind chatter, forgiveness, which is a prerequisite to letting go, 4, letting go and being in the flow, or the zone, and 5, how optimal awareness can be synonymous with spiritual growth. The topics in part 2 cover what is Biocybernaut's spiritual technology, Biocybernaut's unique technology and methods, which include neurofeedback plus psychic mood computers, and I'll go into describing what is a psychic mood computer. We'll do description, overview, and applications, and again discuss optimal awareness leading to spiritual growth, and here I'll tell some stories of spiritual adventures and optimal function, and finally offer to you some invitations and opportunities. Okay, so we begin with the role of beliefs. This is one of my favorite Goethe quotes. Notice that I've made in slightly different color a qualifier that he put in to avoid the wrath of the church at the time that he said it. As soon as anybody belongs to a certain narrow creed in science, every unprejudiced and true perception is gone. So one of the things that I do when people come in for training is I talk to them about willing suspension of belief. Now, you all know that in order to go to the theater, you have to practice something that's called willing suspension of disbelief. Somebody stands up on the stage with a mop in their hand, and you have to see it as the king's scepter. Or if they gesture grandly to the empty stage, you have to see the teeming multitude there. There's no teeming multitude, but by practicing willing suspension of disbelief, you can get into the play and you can appreciate more of the emotional content that's available in the play. Well, just as it's important to participate in theater, to practice willing suspension of disbelief, in any kind of growth work, it's very valuable to practice willing suspension of belief. Now, we're not talking about getting rid of beliefs, we're just talking about checking them at the door when you walk in. You can pick them up on the way out at the end of the day, but if you're in the chamber and something comes up, well, to give you an example, in 1999 we had a Mormon group come forward, and they were sponsoring some technology developments that we were doing, and they referred a large number of people from their community. One of the things that happens from time to time in the training, when the brainwaves are appropriate, is people will have the perception of what are generically called astral plane beings. Most people would describe them as angels, but they don't all have white wings and wear, white gowns and have long flowing blonde hair. The astral plane beings come in a variety of sizes and shapes. And when some of the people from the Mormon community began seeing angels, they were, first of all, delighted, but they were also terrified, and they would bring me aside, so behind the chamber and whisper, well, I don't know what the church fathers would think, whether they would approve of me seeing these kinds of things. So there's always a problem if people have beliefs about what's appropriate or what's inappropriate or what's allowed or disallowed for them to see, for them to participate in any kind of growth process. As a group, the most exciting group that I ever worked with was U.S. Army Green Berets. We had, for a time, the technology installed at a secret Army base, and we trained 2 12-man teams of Green Berets. Now, they were told, you will volunteer for this program, and so you don't, in fact, have to be spiritually inclined in order to benefit. All you have to do is go into the chamber, make the tones get louder, meaning your alpha brainwaves will increase, and then these interesting and powerful things begin to happen. You don't have to believe that they're going to happen. You don't have to want them to happen. When you produce the appropriate brainwaves, they will happen. And one of the things that characterized the Green Berets was what I call, they had an ethos of training. They were dedicated so that every day when they got up, they were determined that by the end of the day they were going to be better in some way that was related to their mission. They didn't take a day off. Every day was an opportunity to get better. Now, I've worked with professional athletes. And professional athletes, when they're in training and when it's the season, they are very dedicated. But when it's not the season, they may drink and they may drug and they may overeat. And so they didn't have the level of commitment, dedication to training that I saw in the U.S. Army Green Berets. It was a very select group. They were being trained for non-combatant missions, which required that they have tremendous empathy with local populations. And it is interesting that out of the 24 who trained, 3 of them decided that they no longer had a future in the Army and that they had a higher calling. The ones that remained, in fact, were totally dedicated to fulfilling their purpose in a way that delighted them and their commanders, who were always looking for a way to weed out people who were not 100% committed to their mission. So it's important when doing the training to practice willing suspension of belief, so that if something happens, well, to give you an example, many of the people who go through this training experience out-of-body experiences. And one of the ways that this may begin to happen is that people start to feel light in the chair. And if they have a belief or an attitude about this, they will focus on it with their rational mind in such a way that it shuts the process off. If they can just go with the experience, then they can literally follow that, intensify it, and go into having out-of-body experience. But if they have a belief that it's wrong or it's not appropriate or only people back in the time of the Bible, were allowed to have such experiences, then they will shut off experiences as they begin to occur, and they won't then have the fullness of the experiences that they can have. Now, unlike drugs, this process, I tell people there's good news and bad news. The good news is you only get as much as you can handle. You can't OD on brainwave feedback. And the bad news is you only get as much as you can handle. So if you become afraid when some of these phenomena start to occur, the fear will cause a reduction of the alpha. You'll go through an orienting response. The alpha will be reduced in amplitude, and it'll throttle back on the experience. So in fact, you only get as much as you can handle. Okay, what about distractions and negative mind chatter? We talked with the Zen Master who did the training 3 years ago in 2000. In the experience of spiritual growth, quieting the mind is extremely important. Stilling the internal dialogues, especially the negative voices, are important. Now, one of the interesting things about training a Zen Master, we had done training previously with people who were beginner, intermediate, and even advanced Zen. But this was the first Zen Master who had actually done the training. He had his own large temple in Japan, and he was here in the US for other reasons. And he came and did the training. He said that the Biocybernaut training doubled his understanding of the dimensionality of consciousness. He said that it corrected aspects of his practice of Zen, confirmed others, and overall deepened his practice of Zen. Now, in Zen, if you're sitting there practicing Zazen, you're observing your awareness. If a distraction bubbles up to the surface, rather than saying, no, 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 it's not supposed to be there, and trying to push it away, what they do in Zen is they simply expand their awareness further so that the distraction becomes functionally a smaller percentage of their total awareness. But it's not gone, it's just a smaller percentage. Well, one of the things that he was able to learn in his training is about forgiveness, which is a prerequisite to letting go. All of the meditative traditions speak to the importance of non-attachment and letting go. But what we have learned is that until you have forgiven, it's not possible to deeply let go. So let's look at this forgiveness a little bit. Many spiritual traditions preach or teach non-attachment, not realizing that if you haven't forgiven, then you cannot let go. When you forgive, the energy and the itch, so to speak, that fuels the distractions and the internal dialogues is removed. And so it was entirely foreign to the Zen Master's lifelong practice of meditation when a distraction came up to, in a sense, follow it to its source. It's like the dandelion. If you pick the flower, as long as the root is still there, it's going to come back. And so forgiveness is a process, and we'll talk a little bit later in the second set of topics about how the psychic mood scale computers help you identify what is the source in your history of these distractions that keep coming to the surface, and then how forgiveness can in fact work very, very powerfully. Letting go and being in the flow, being in the zone. I think it was Yogi Berra who said, how can I hit and think at the same time? One of the famous football players, professional football players who did the training, was asked at one point, he'd done a 98-yard return of a kickoff, and when he was asked what he was thinking about, he said, I wasn't thinking about anything. I was being the return. If he was running down the field thinking, oh my God, I got to watch out for and make sure I keep my feet, all of that, he's not in the flow, he's not in the zone, and so his performance is not optimal. So suspension of thinking, suspension of rational analytical thinking is essential. In optimal awareness, the equivalence to spiritual growth. This is a very interesting graph. Now, it might look like the former World Trade Center towers, but actually it's two pulses of light. This was from a study that was done. The light was displayed by a machine beloved of experimental psychologists. It's called a tachistoscope, and it's optimized for presenting very short, very precisely timed flashes of light to study psychophysiology. And so on the bottom axis, you can see we're looking at time in milliseconds, and the eyes here represent the intensity of the light. And so what people in 4 groups were shown was darkness, then the light was turned on, it was kept steady for a very short period of time, it was turned off and left off for a moment, and then turned on again, left on, turned off, and then it was dark all the way to the end of that testing period. Now, the 4 groups of people who saw this display of light were non-meditators, beginning meditators, intermediate meditators, and advanced meditators. And the first 3 groups, the beginning, and the intermediate meditators, when they were shown this, reported that they saw a flash of light. a flash of light. That was it. They didn't see the nuances, they didn't see the detail. The advanced meditators, who had had never any training in perception of very short flashes of light, they had simply trained to observe the internal processes of their consciousness, free of judgment, free of belief. What they saw was, and they reported, everyone in the advanced meditator group reported seeing a short period of darkness, a period of rising intensity of light, a period of steady intensity of light, a period of falling intensity of light, a short period of darkness, a second period of rising intensity of light, a period of steady intensity of light, a period of falling intensity of light, and then a long period of darkness. So the only thing that distinguished these groups was one had done meditation for a long time and had become good at it. Duration of practice does not necessarily correlate with proficiency of meditation. So the advanced meditators had in fact been rated by their teachers as advanced in meditation. And so this is a simple perceptual example of how, if you have done the work of spiritual development, you will then exhibit optimal function, at least when we're talking about visual perception. But it goes across the board. This is just one of the simple examples that's easy to describe. Okay, what is Biocybernaut? We're now in topics part 2. What is Biocybernaut's spiritual technology? What is its unique methods? And the neurofeedback is a part of it, but it's not just neurofeedback. It also includes psychic mood computers, and we'll go through description, overview, and applications. The Biocybernaut spiritual technology includes unique, in fact, patented technology and methodology, exceptional neurofeedback technology, and psychic mood scale computers. Okay, what is Biocybernaut training? It's spiritual growth programs. They produce optimal function, and this occurs by increasing alpha EEG. Pictures being worth many thousands of words. This is an example of somebody seated in one of the soundproof chambers. You can see the back walls. It's roughly a cube. The technician is right here plugging in the head box here, which gathers all the wires, which are all over the gentleman's head. And from here it goes out into the amplifiers, and then into the filters and into the computer. And then the computer is connected to a music synthesizer. So it's kind of like having your head plugged directly into a music synthesizer. And so when your alpha waves increase, you hear a variety of musical instruments. In the level 1 training, people start out with flutes. Although we have 8 electrodes on the head, and we'll show you, maybe we could switch to the slides for just a moment, because I think I have queued up a slide that shows the head sites. Yeah, you can just cover that. Okay, let's go one more. Advance. Forward. Yeah, forward. Okay, this is the International 1020 system of electrode placement. And our trainees get feedback from O1 and O2 and C3 and C4. In addition, non-feedback electrodes that record their brainwaves are attached at T3 and T4 and F3 and F4. So viewed from the side, we're measuring the back, the top, the side, and the front of the brain. And the feedback occurs from these 4 sites, and the notes that come from there, initially flutes, are arranged to form a chord. So this would be bum, 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 bum. And so if you make alpha at this site, you get the low note of the chord. Here you get the next note of the chord, here the next note, and this is the octave. And so the speakers, if we can go back now please to the PowerPoint projector. The speakers are, one set of them is right here. Here's the other set. These wooden uprights run in tracks in the ceiling. So when the person is plugged in and the technician leaves, the speakers are rolled in their tracks so that they're right next to the people's ears. So you have all the advantages of earphones without the cumbersomeness of the weight, plus you also have ear clip electrodes here with paste, and if you had earphones on, they would tend to get sticky. So the two speakers here and the two speakers here then will bring the sounds to the person, and because they're panned stereoscopically, it goes bum, 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 bum. So you hear the 4 notes from 4 different spatial locations. So you have pitch cues and spatial cues to tell you where on your head you are producing brainwaves in every given moment. Now, a little bit later, we'll see examples of some brainwaves, and in the handouts, you can also see before and after examples of brainwaves. There's a brainwaves in there from a 74-year-old woman who had been depressed for 7 years since the death of her beloved husband, and her alpha waves showed the signs both of advanced aging and also of depression. Following 7 days of training, the woman is radiant, she's filled with joy, and she's got the brainwaves of a young woman. And she had performance to match. She was able to go back to painting. Okay, so here we are in the chamber. Now this is very interesting because this gentleman had done meditation for 45 years. As a young man, he lived at the Yogananda Center in Southern California. He knew Yogananda, and every day he had done meditation. Now, it turns out that, and we'll see a slide shortly that says, although practice makes perfect, wrong practice does not make perfect. And so one of the things about the Biocybernaut training, the feedback, it can help you to change wrong practice to right practice. This gentleman, when he did his meditation, actually reduced his alpha. What he was doing actually made less alpha. And although he looked and looks like the perfect meditator, I mean, when he would sit there in his posture, you know, with the chiseled beard, he was a model as a young man. He was inside, actually, a deeply embittered old man. And he had this story going, like, my wife left me for a millionaire, kind of like that. Well, when you got into the story, he had met at the Yogananda Center a beautiful young woman, and they had fallen in love, and they decided to get married. Now, before getting married, he told this beautiful young woman that he intended to have a celibate marriage. He wanted to model himself after Yogananda. His parents, I think, they only had sex, you know, on like several-year rotation and only for the purpose of having a child and so on. So that's the kind of marriage he wanted to have. So several years into this marriage, he wasn't even touching his wife, and hugs were banned also because they might awaken sexual desire. And so this lonely, poor, lonely young woman met somebody who, in fact, hugged her and kissed her and married her, and he, oh, by the way, happened to be a millionaire. And so this man had a range of grievances against all the members of his family. Hadn't talked to his sister for 26 years. Just as an example. And on the day that I think it was day 5 of the training, when he got into his forgiveness work, he forgave his sister deeply and authentically. The next morning, she called him at his hotel room. 1,000 miles away, she had felt the shift in the energy, and she called his place of work because she was family. They told her, well, he's in California doing this program. They gave her the hotel room, the hotel number. She called, and they were reconciled on the phone. But he had done the work first in the chamber. After 26 years of not talking to his sister, he did the forgiveness work, and once again they were united as brother and sister. This woman was a Berkeley professor, and she had issues going related to lack of self-worth. As a young woman, you know, as a girl and as a young woman, she was never able to earn the approval of her father. She had brothers, and the father lavished all of his attention on the boys. And even though this girl would work and work and work and study, and she got straight A's, her father never noticed. And so she finally worked so hard that she became a Berkeley professor, but she still had these deep feelings of unworthiness. And so in the course of the training, she was able to heal that. You know the saying, it's never too late to have a happy childhood. And so what she did was she literally recreated some of the traumatic scenes of her childhood and scripted them differently so that when she brought home her all-A report card, her father noticed it and gave her a hug, just little things like that. And she was able to overcome a lifetime of lack of self-worth. This woman had been doing Yogananda meditation for 15 years, and she had always wanted to have an out-of-body experience and had never been able to have that. And in the course of her 7-day training, she was able to develop her alpha waves in the way that lead to having out-of-body experience. Biocybernaut Institute Brainwave training programs will in fact increase your alpha. Now here I mentioned I would show you some pictures of brainwaves. This is the 8-channel EEG of a depressed 74-year-old woman before her Biocybernaut Alpha training. And here's the same woman after, and I'll go back and forth. This is before and after, before and after, before and after. You don't need statistics to see that there's bigger brainwaves. These, in fact, are alpha brainwaves. These marks along the top, these are 1-second intervals. Alpha is typically 8 to 13 cycles per second. So what you see here are really long, extended bursts of alpha, and in fact, they spread all the way forward on the head. If we go back and look at the beginning, in the frontal sites, you see a mixed pattern of beta, which is the little black stuff, and theta, which are these bigger, where there's more space in between the waves. And this is a senile EEG pattern. One of the things that we did with a federal grant, $250,000 federal grant at Langley Porter, UCSF, it was entitled Anxiety and Aging, Intervention with EEG Alpha Feedback. And so we took women who were from 60 up into their 80s, and we provided them with this training. And it was as though we had given them to drink of the fountain of youth. We had women in their mid-70s going back to college, getting degrees, getting advanced degrees, becoming things like professional therapists, starting new businesses. There was a 74-year-old woman, not this one, but another 74-year-old woman who took a 45-year-old man as her lover, and he pronounced her both spiritually and sexually fulfilling. So there is, people in the gerontology field, like Obrist and Bussey and so on, have for long said there's tremendous amount of skill and ability in the older organisms, but they hadn't known really how to bring it out. Some of the mechanisms underlying this, as people get older, there is a reduction of the blood supply to the brain. You all know this. Once atherosclerosis sets in, the frequency of the alpha wave slows by 0.8 of a hertz per decade. A hertz is 1 cycle per second. And so, depending on diet and genetics, a person in their early 20s can have onset of atherosclerosis. And as alpha slows, it might start out at 11 or 10 cycles per second, something like that. Once it slows down below 8 and drops off the end, then people enter various stages of senility and senescence. And up till now, there hasn't been a way to bring people back from that, not a practical way. And so what we found in the federal grant was that by training older people, in fact, very old people into their 80s, that the restoration of youthful brain waves brought restoration of youthful function. There was one interesting study that was done by a scientist named Flügel, and he was working with hypoxic patients. Hypoxics are people who, for one reason or another, don't get enough oxygen to the brain. Usually their blood vessels are small and they're constricted. And so what he did was he got permission from his Human Subjects Committee to give these people on a one-time basis only a very dangerous but very powerful drug that would expand the blood vessels. Now, hypoxic patients are characterized by loss of alpha, loss of psychic drive, and loss of intellectual function. And what Flügel found when he gave them this injection of this powerful drug, that their blood vessels were forced open, blood returned to the brain, the alpha came back, the psychic drive was restored, and their intellectual function came back. But after about 4 hours, the drug wore off, and they went back to quasi-vegetablehood, which is the characteristic of most hypoxics. The only thing modern medical science has been able to do for these people is to put them in a hyperbaric chamber. and crank up the pressure to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 atmospheres in a pure oxygen atmosphere, which forces oxygen into the tissues, and so the diminished blood flow to the brain will then deliver a little bit more oxygen. But what happens here in the brainwave training is that people learn how to voluntarily dilate the blood vessels that feed the brain. You know, in hand temperature feedback, where you put a little probe on the finger and you run a meter or a little beeper that beeps faster when it warms, what people are learning how to do is to dilate the blood vessels that feed the finger. And when more warm blood flows out from the periphery, the fingers and the toes get warmer. In fact, it's a cure for Raynaud's disease, which is very painful. In medical profession, the only thing they've been able to do is to amputate the fingers and toes that are painfully blue and cold. But with temperature training, they don't need to amputate the fingers and toes. They simply teach the people how to dilate their blood vessels. Well, alpha training, in a sense, teaches some of that to people, and along with that go a wide variety of benefits. We'll get to talking about benefits a little bit later. So here we'll just bounce back and forth. There's the before, there's the after. Afterwards, there's lots more alpha. And those are the 8 sites we measure. These are from the back of the head, the 2 occipital, the 2 central at the top, the 2 temporal at the side, and the 2 frontal at the front part of the brain. Okay, brainwave changes of Zen meditators. In Zen, you have increase of alpha waves, bigger amplitudes, longer lasting alpha spindles, and more power in the alpha band, and alpha spreading forward on the head. Now, let me see what's, yes, and then when the advanced Zen meditators, there's the slowing of the alpha frequencies, and this was an interesting study. It was done in Japan by Kasamatsu and Hirai, and they used meditators from the 2 main schools of Zen, the Soto and the Rinzai sects of Zen. And each meditator had been rated by their Zen master for level of spiritual development. They were rated beginner, intermediate, and advanced. No one was in the advanced group who had less than 21 years of practice. And in that advanced group, in addition to those other changes, increase of alpha, slowing of alpha, spreading forward on the head, the advanced group had the emergence of frontal theta, which is F3 and F4 cortical sites. And so I think what we want to do here is jump over to Excel. Because here what we see is a graph, a colorful graph, which is the result of 17 right-handed Americans ranging in age from, I think, 20 to about 65, who had come in, they weren't part of a group, but they had just come in over time, and they had done the Biocybernaut training. We chose right-handers because there were more of them, and we wanted everybody to be the same handedness in the study. But what we see here, graphed, are the increases in the brainwaves at different places in the head. Now, what you see here, we probably want to look at some of the other sites, the other views of this. For example, maybe we want to start here. Okay, this is the cumulative EEG change scores, feedback minus baseline, in microvolts, summed across 7 days of alpha feedback, representing the average trainee's EEG changes as a function of frequency and head site. Only statistically significant changes are shown. They have to be significant at the p less than 0.05 or better. In other words, fewer than 5 chances out of 100 that this could have occurred by chance. And here we have the head sites. From the back of the head, there's O1, O2, C3, C4, T3, T4, F3, F4. And then we have the frequencies going this way. Delta being the slowest, then slow theta, fast theta, slow alpha, broadband alpha, fast alpha, slow beta, and broadband beta. And so the purple represents the broadband alpha. And so what we see in this group of, none of these people had ever meditated before, you see alpha increasing and spreading forward on the head. The yellow bars, columns, represent the slow alpha. So the alpha has increased, it spread forward on the head. The slow alpha has increased, and it spread forward on the head. And also, look here, at the 2 frontal sites, you see increases of fast theta and slow theta. Now, this combination of results is exactly what's seen in that advanced group of Zen meditators, none of whom had less than 21 years of daily practice. The ones who only had 18 years or 19 years or 20 years did not show the complete pattern. And yet in 7 days, using the technology, ordinary non-meditating Americans were able to produce this pattern of changes which only the 21-plus year veterans of Zen were able to show. And then we can look at some of the individual pairs of sites. For example, if we look at the occipitals, you can see both broadband alpha and the slow alpha increasing. If we go forward and look at the centrals, you see increases of both of the two alphas, a little beta increase there, a little delta decrease there. At the temporals, you see both fast or broadband and slow alpha are increasing. And at the frontals, there you see the pattern that was seen only in the advanced Zen, where the broadband alpha increases at F3 and F4, left and right frontal. The slow alpha increases, the fast theta increases, and the slow theta increases. And then we'll also rotate the whole picture a little bit so you can see it from several different views. It's the same data, just being able to kind of peek behind the columns. Okay. So in Zen, we see bigger amplitudes, longer lasting alpha spindles, more power in the alpha band, alpha spreading forward on the head, and slowing of alpha frequency. In the advanced group, 21 plus years of Zen meditation, also the emergence of frontal theta at F3 and F4 cortical sites. Same result we see in 7 days using the technology. Okay, so brainwave changes. Now here, expansion of awareness and spiritual growth. In February of 2000, the Zen Master did the Biocybernaut training, said that it enhanced his practice of Zen meditation. He said it doubled his understanding of the dimensionality of consciousness, and what Godmother and apple pie is to an American, duty is to a Japanese. And so at the end of his training, I said in very hesitating, highly qualified words, do you think, Master Ruho, that there's any chance that someday you might consider the possibility of coming to the US and working with us? And he looked at me immediately and said, I consider it my duty. And in fact, he went back to Japan and got a visa, and he's now here semi-permanently in the United States. And so he trained in February of 2000. In October, I interviewed him on camera. I'm sorry I don't have time this evening to show you the video of that interview, but I want to share with you a few excerpts. At one point, I asked him a question about tune-ups. Now, once somebody has done the 7-day program, then they can come back and do 1 day or 2 days or 3 days or any number of days they want. The first 7 days need to be done as a group. We do have a 2-day sample of the process, but everyone who's come to do the 2-day sample, I tell them make sure that you have your schedule clear so that if you want to, you can continue, and everyone who's done the 2-day sample has in fact continued on to do the full 7 days. So I was asking Master Ruho, what should be the frequency? How often people should do tune-ups and how long a tune-up should last? And he's very thoughtful, and he goes, people are so different, very difficult to say. And I go, well, what about you? And he brightened and he goes, the sooner the better and every day is how he would like to do it. So, as I said earlier, wrong practice does not make perfect. And I'll show you some charts in a moment to demonstrate that. The Biocybernaut training changes wrong practice to right practice. If we could go to the slides again, please. And maybe back up one. Yeah, back up. Now, this sort of teaching slide is important for you to understand the slides that I'm going to show you about the Zen graphs. You take some EEG, which has the wiggles here. You have fast wiggles, and you have slower wiggles, and you have even slower wiggles. And so you feed all these wiggles into a computer, and it does something called power spectral analysis. Fourier analysis. And basically what it does is it breaks down the frequencies, like here you have delta, which came from here and here. Here you have the alpha, which came from here, and the theta, which came from here. So what it does is it breaks it down, because even within the delta there's a range of frequencies. The delta range is 0 to 4. The theta range is 4 to 7. The alpha range is 8 to actually 13 in most cases. And then from 13 up to about 25 is beta, and above that is gamma. So basically what we do is we feed in the raw EEG, and then what we get out is a graph that shows us the bigger the graph, the more power there is in those frequencies. And then the computer will smooth it, so this data here, which is the rough histograms, say on a half-hertz basis, are smoothed. And then that's one sample of data. That could be 10 seconds, it could be a minute. And then the next minute, you graph it as though the time axis went up like this. And so the second minute of data is graphed behind this, and the dotted lines indicate that if something is behind a bigger peak, it's not shown. It's called the hidden line technique. And so what you do is you build up, with time going like this and frequency going like this, you build up a series of mountain ranges that show you at a glance how much energy there is at different frequencies. Okay, so this is, there's a lot of very complicated math that goes into this process, but the long and the short of it is we take a set of wiggles, and what we do is we get graphs that look like mountain ranges, where depending on where the mountain range is, that's what frequency, like this is alpha, and this is theta, and this is delta, and up here is beta. Okay, if we can now go forward. And then here we have the head chart to review. We're going to be in the training. We do training from O1, O2, C3, C4, and we passively measure and write out on the polygraph the two frontals and the two temporals, okay, and then forward. Okay, now this is a graph of a control subject who was age matched to a Zen Master who was in this study. And here you see the power spectrum that I talked about. Everything under the yellow is the power spectrum. And so the frequencies, the numbers here, it goes from 2 cycles per second up to about 13. So it covers half of the delta range, all of the theta, and all of the alpha. And each line represents 1 minute of recording. These are the two occipitals. These are the two temporals, left and right, and these are the two frontals. Now, in between, connected by dark lines, this is the coherence. Now, coherence is a derived measure that tells us whether the brain waves at two different sites on the head are moving together like this, or if they're moving opposite, they're not coherent. If they're moving together, going up and down at the same time and at the same frequency, then you get coherence, which is either not there at all or it's large. And so this is the coherence mainly based on, he's got, in Zen is done eyes half open. So this control subject basically sits there in the chamber, wiggles a little, and then falls asleep. And the coherence is just based on noise. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. Here we have a man who's rated by the Zen Master as a beginning meditator. Now, this man, his whole house is set up like for meditation. You get there, and there's statues of the Buddha, and there's fountains, and he has a meditation room. It's very prominent. And this man, twice a day, every day, hasn't missed a meditation for 10 years. And when he sits down and does his baselines, his eyes closed baselines, he has a little bit of alpha in this channel. When he starts his meditation, what little alpha he has goes away. It's called trying, okay? And the Zen Master knows this. He rates the guy as a beginner. He's been doing this religiously for 10 years, and when he sits down to meditate, what little alpha he has goes away. Later, this man came and did the Brainwave training, and he was able to sort of get on track with meditation. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Now here we see a meditator who has a little bit more experience in terms of doing it right. Not as many years of training, but this one is rated as an intermediate. And so you see sporadically from time to time that there is alpha occurring during the meditation. There are points where the person is doing really rather well, and at other points they're struggling. And they also have some coherence present right here. And the alpha on this side, actually, the right side is doing probably a little better. And at the baseline at the end, when they're sitting in baseline, then they're not even trying to meditate, and look at how big the alpha gets then, especially at the occipital. So even the intermediate meditator is having problems of trying. Okay, now if we can go to the next slide. Now, there should be several slides in between. I wanted to show you an advanced meditator and so on. This is a slide that represents a Zen Master. Now, in this particular technique, instead of referring the brainwaves to the ears like we normally do, we use differential amplifiers that record the differences in voltage between two sites. For the Zen study, because we wanted to measure the coherence, we had to refer to another active site. So everything on this side of the head was referred to the right central. Everything on this side of the head was referred to the left central. So when the Zen Master began making lots of alpha at the same time at different places on the head, there weren't many differences, and so you don't see much in the power. That's really an artifact of this particular measurement technique. But what you do see is an extraordinary bimodal coherence, where you get coherence in the alpha region and you get coherence in the theta region. And that's between the occipital pair. Also between the temporal pair. You don't see much alpha, but there is this bimodal coherence pattern. The coherence is calculated based on a threshold where the power had to be at least 2/3 of what it was in the baseline in order to count. And so the fact that there wasn't much alpha here at the temporals and the baselines didn't matter, because if it was at least 2/3, then the coherence could be calculated. And also from the temporal, which is at the side, to the back of the head, the occipital, here you see the coherence, and you see on the left side and also on the right side, you see this bimodal coherence. Now this pattern was seen in the Zen Master and only one other of 30 meditators that we did in a study. Nobody got feedback in this study. They simply came in, we put electrodes on, we put them in the chamber and measured them practicing their meditation. So the Zen Master showed this pattern, and one other person who was rated advanced also showed the pattern. Well, as you know from elementary statistics, you only need 1 out of 20 to have statistical significance. Chances are, with 1 out of 20, you've got a 5% chance that that result could have occurred by chance. So p less than 0.05 is the established level for statistical significance, and 1 out of 30, of course, is going to make that criterion. So that's interesting. 1 out of the 30 who also happened to be an advanced meditator also showed this bimodal coherence. But in fact, so what? Well, we just kind of put the data on the shelf and waited. 7 years later, this Zen Master died. Now, it was a conscious passing. He had sent out notices like, next Thursday, I'm leaving my body, come on by. And so the room was filled with about 45 people. And some of them were known to friends of mine. In fact, one of the guys on my dissertation committee, who'd been a grad student under Timothy Leary, was present at this conscious passing. And everybody in the room felt, when the Zen Master died, they felt something leave him and go to it's called giving transmission. And so the Zen Master gave transmission, and that person to whom this energy went was understood as he inherited the mantle, and he became the new Zen Master. Well, that guy was the 1 out of 30 who 7 years earlier had shown a little bit of this bimodal coherence pattern. So now this is a lot more interesting. Now it's not just, another advanced guy who, showed this pattern. Now this is like a marker for Zen Roshihood. Okay? So if you show that, then that's, you're likely to be, in the category of a Zen Master. But at a deep level, that's all very interesting, it's fascinating, I presented some talks on it, but at a deep level, I didn't know, what does this mean? And that remained that way, my ignorance remained in place until April of 1992, when I was in Florida attending a conference on chaos theory. You probably have heard about chaos theory. Chaos theory as applied to analysis of brainwaves. And it was a big room, probably 10 times as many people as here tonight. And Dr. Arnold Mandel was standing up giving a talk. Now, this guy is a real Renaissance man. For years, he had been chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at UC Davis, and then he gave up psychiatry to go be a professor of mathematics. So now he's in his guise as a professor of mathematics, and he's giving this talk on chaos theory as applied to analysis of brainwaves. And I have some overheads at some point. If we get into the questions, I may be able to show them. But basically, he went up to the board, and he drew, just kind of crudely, a monkey brain. And then he drew a torus over the top of the monkey brain. Now, anybody know what a torus is? Yes?
Donut.
Yeah, a torus is a donut. And the way you get a torus, mathematics, is you take a circle with radius little r, and then you take a point outside the circle, where that's big R, and you revolve the little circle around the big one, sweeping out a volume, which is like a cylinder that's bent into the form of a donut. And so he drew that donut over the top of the monkey brain. And then he starts talking about the radius of the little circle as one frequency, and the radius of the big circle as another frequency. And then he went in to talk about Fibonacci numbers. Now, Fibonacci numbers are, there's an infinite series of Fibonacci numbers, and the way you get the next one is by adding together the two previous ones. So it goes out infinitely, and it has a whole bunch of interesting properties. Like if you take any two adjacent Fibonacci numbers and you divide one by the other, you will never get a whole number. It's always, always irrational. And that turns out, he says, it's very important. And brainwaves, he said, follow Fibonacci scaling. Well, immediately I didn't understand that, because if you add the center frequency of delta to the center frequency of theta, you don't get the center frequency of alpha. And so there was something wrong. But then he said, contrary to everybody's misunderstanding, delta is not a monolith. Delta is actually two different brainwaves. They come from different generators in the head, and so we need to talk about slow delta and fast delta. And then if you add the center frequency of slow delta to the center frequency of fast delta, boom, you get the center frequency of theta. Then if you take the center frequency of fast delta and the center frequency of theta, add them together, you get the center frequency of alpha. Similarly, the center frequencies of theta and alpha added together give you the center frequency of beta, and the center frequencies of alpha and beta added together give you the center frequencies of gamma. And so, with a wave of a hand, he's demonstrated that brainwaves follow Fibonacci scaling, which means that the ratios of any two adjacent brainwaves will be an irrational number. Now, he said that's really important because this torus that he drew over the head of the monkey brain, he said that exists in a mathematical abstraction called phase space. And if there's any engineers here, you will know that if you take two frequencies and you beat them together, you feed them together in the right way, you will get a torus in phase space. And if they are related such as the ratio of the two numbers are irrational, as this thing approaches the border of chaos, it'll remain stable. Well, I did something I've never done in a professional talk before. I jumped up out of my seat, and I interrupted the speaker, and I shouted, "I've got two people in my database, and they show that pattern." And one was a Zen Master, and one was a guy who got transmission when the Zen Master died. And he paused, and he was very gracious. He said, "Well, this is fascinating. I'm really pleased to hear about this. Would you please, at the end of the talk come up, because you and I are probably going to talk for 3 hours." And we did. And so then he went on with his talk. But what I had seen was a halo over the head of these people. So then I told a bunch of people about this, and one of my friends went out, and he went to the library, and he got color Xeroxes from art books of pictures of saints in a variety of great religions. It's not just Christianity that paints halos. The Buddha is depicted with halos, and Krishna and Arjuna are sometimes depicted with halos in the Hindu tradition. And so what I did then was I measured the major and the minor radii of these halos, and I was able to calculate backward and tell you what brainwaves that same halo is back here, just kind of like that. Sometimes it goes all the way around the head, sometimes it's over on one side. But all of this can be explained by reference to the electrophysiology of the brainwaves. And there is a program of training that could teach people how to do that, and we'll talk a little bit further about what's involved in that. So here you see a brainwave pattern in a Zen Master, which Years later, I discovered this guy would have had a halo over his head. Oh, I'm sorry. We need to go back to the PowerPoint projector. Yes, right. Okay, wrong practice does not make perfect. Biocybernaut training changes wrong practice to right practice. Okay, now what is a psychic mood computer? We need to spend some time with this. We'll do a little bit of description of the Biocybernaut training. Spiritual growth programs, increase consciousness, enable optimal function. All experiences, this is a description of neurofeedback, all experiences have unique patterns of brainwaves, thinking, feeling, behaving. For example, if you were analyzing or deducing or categorizing or reflecting, you would have very different brainwaves than if you were in the experience of anger or fear or of compassion or joy or ecstasy or delight. If you are doing marksmanship, you have a particular pattern of brainwaves. If you're bicycling, flying an airplane, playing a musical instrument, sinking a putt, there is a unique pattern of brainwaves that's good for each one of these tasks. And let's talk about marksmanship a little bit, okay? This was certainly of interest to the Green Berets, but it's also of interest to the Olympic team. Now, it's hard to measure brainwaves if somebody's moving. Brainwaves are just a few millionths of a volt, and if you just clench your jaw, you produce voltages that are thousands of times bigger. So people have to be standing still or sitting still in order to get good measurements of brainwaves. So anybody, what athletic performance has the person standing still before they do the performance? Any suggestion? Archery, yes. I don't know about gymnastics. I don't think that's been studied. What's that? Marksmanship, yes, whether with a rifle, pistol, a bow and arrow, a golfer before they putt, and a basketball player at free throw. All of these have been measured. And what they have found is that if there is a big burst of alpha waves just before the athlete emits the performance, that's going to be one of their best shots. And so the U.S. Olympic team has actually, in some instances, trained marksmen how to make alpha. Now, there was a very interesting study done with college students where they were taking a 16-week course in archery. They didn't give them any brainwave feedback, but what they did do is measure their brainwaves at the beginning of the course and at the end of the course. Now, as you can imagine, with college students coming together, some of them got really good. They were right-on archers. The arrow would go right to the bullseye every time. And others, well, you better not stand close because those arrows are going to go, every which way. The ones who got good would produce a big burst of alpha just before their shots. So there's something about the process of developing skill which, if people have the ability to turn on more alpha, then they are going to become good at what they're doing. Not everybody has this ability innately, which is why even the best teacher of archery or of basketball or of whatever is going to get everybody to be good at that particular athletic performance. But if you add in brainwave training directly so that people who don't have this ability to increase their alpha can have that skill learned, then they can apply that skill in many of the different aspects of their daily life. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here because I want to talk about creativity. Because it turns out that the only way you can have a creative inspiration is to have a big burst of alpha. In the mid-'80s, a researcher named Colin Martindale, working at the University of Maine in Orono, Maine, did some very, very important work, sort of baseline work with creativity. He went out and he found people who had the obvious indicia of creativity. They had patents, they had publications, they had paintings, they had sculptures. And so he put them in a group and he called them the creative group. Then he went out and found another group that was matched in terms of age and sex and various other demographic variables who didn't have patents or publications or paintings or things like that, and he called those the normals. Then he brought these two groups into his laboratory, put brainwave electrodes on them, and he measured them in two tasks. One was just sitting, resting, and another was he would give them problems to work on. Well, In the creative group, when they were at rest, they actually had slightly less, not much, but they had slightly less alpha than the normals. The normals, oh, nothing to do, rest, okay, oh, they're just kind of kicked back, relaxing, and that will, be a moderately small increase of alpha. The creative people, on the other hand, found themselves in a new environment. They're looking around, wow, what's this? They're like making mental notes, they're very active, very engaged, and so they had slightly less alpha at rest, because they weren't resting, they were, taking in data. Then he gave the two groups problems to work on. The normals continued to sit there in their normal brainwave state and did only as well as normals usually do on creative problems. On the other hand, the creative people immediately, creative problem, they immediately turned on a high alpha state within which they quickly and effectively solved the problem in a manner which distinguished them as creative people. And so Colin Martindale said, creativity is simply a matter of having the right brainwaves. He went further. In the mid-'80s, brainwave feedback was known. Now, it wasn't well known, and the details of how to do it, there's thousands of ways to do it wrong, and there's only a few ways to do it that are optimized. So what he did was he gave people in the normal group, he gave them some alpha training. Now, he only gave them 800 seconds total feedback. On our first day of the 7-day training, people get many, many times that amount of training. And so it wasn't enough training, and so he basically shot himself in the foot and didn't learn anything, and he cut himself off from what could have been a very fruitful line of research. We have actually done a research study. We took, in fact, I think one of the papers in your handout is entitled Creativity Increases Among Scientists. We went to some top scientists at Stanford Research Institute, and we brought them in, we measured their creativity, we gave them a week of training, and then we measured their creativity again. On average, they increased 50%. These guys, their bread and butter is creativity. They're already at very, very high levels of creativity, and yet by learning to increase their alpha, they went into still higher levels of creativity. In the control group, who had their muscle tension measured, and they had their blood pressure measured, and they had their skin temperature measured, and they had their respiration measured, and their electrical conductivity of the skin measured. No brainwave feedback, no increases in creativity. It was confined to the group that got the alpha training. Okay, so thank you for allowing the digression. Now here's the first axiom of biofeedback. When I was a grad student, I formulated the axioms of biofeedback. The first axiom is, any process in our brains or our bodies of which we can be made aware, we can learn to control. And so you see now a variety of applications. Bladder and bowel incontinence can be trained with biofeedback. People who make too much acid in their stomach can be trained. People who have bad respiration patterns can be trained. Any process in your brain or body about which you can be made aware, you can learn to control. The key is feedback. Feedback has to be accurate, has to be immediate, and has to be reasonably aesthetic. So one of the things that we would like in the future to do is to assemble a library, like the Library of Alexandria, of spiritual masters, so that somebody who has spent 40 years mastering a particular tradition can come in and in a few weeks learn a number of other traditions by matching the brainwaves of people doing those particular spiritual practices. Again, wrong practice does not make perfect. Biocybernaut training changes wrong practice to right practice. What is this Biocybernaut technology for optimal functioning, and is it actable? That's a term from theater. The means of achieving spiritual growth are well known: quieting the mind, stilling the internal dialogues, and opening our hearts. Much easier to say than to do. Okay, so now we're back to this question. What is a psychic mood computer? Let's go further and ask, what is the value of a psychic in a neurofeedback session? And I have actually, on occasions, hired psychics, brought them in. I wanted to have an additional source of information about what was going on with people. The way the training works, people come in, they sit at a table, their heads are measured, their electrodes are put on, and then they see a short video, they go into their chambers, they fill out their first set of computerized mood scales, then they do baselines, brainwave baselines, and the brainwave training in the chambers. At the end of the brainwave training, in which they practice both lowering the alpha and increasing it, then they do a second set of computerized mood scales, a few more baselines, and they come out, and I run a video camera and I interview each person individually, in turn, asking them to tell me about their session. What did you do? What happened? When you did that, then what happened? How did, you know, and so that can take 10 minutes, it can take an hour and a half, depending on the richness of the person's experience. When everyone has had this opportunity to make what we call the subjective report, then we bring in a catered meal. We ask people to follow Ben Franklin's recommendations of breakfast like a king or queen, lunch like a prince or a princess, and supper like a pauper. So the evening meal is soup and salad to allow them to sleep more deeply. Rest is very important because people work quite hard at dealing with their inner issues. And following the meal, then we bring out the data, the polygraph records where we have, I showed you some examples of before and after brainwave tracings. And we go over logs, we have computer graphs that show their performance over time. And finally, we go over the computerized mood scales. And that's where we see the value of a psychic in the training. Neurofeedback plus psychic insights lead to faster spiritual growth and faster attainment of optimal function. So here what I'd like to do is to tell you a little bit about the quote-unquote psychic mood scale computers. When people take these mood scales, their brains are wired and they're plugged in, and the computer is analyzing, you know, many things that are going on. And so a specific story would be, we had a guy who was the CEO of a $1 billion corporation. And he's there in his three-piece suit and his starched white shirt. And at the end of everything, he wanted to go first when it was time to go and review the mood scales. Well, the top of his list is the word angry, which he denied. He put 0. You rate yourself on how you feel on these different emotions, 0 through 4, where 4 is extremely. He put 0. But the computer was not buying it. It was not buying that answer. And it expresses its doubt in terms of the number of sigmas. 1 sigma is a 68% chance the computer's right, the person's wrong. 2 sigma is a 95% chance the computer's right, the person's wrong. 3 sigma is a 99.5% chance the computer's right, the person's wrong. Well, this guy had 5 sigmas, okay? And so I gave this little introduction. You know, sometimes we have emotions that are present, they're influencing our behavior, it may be ruining our relationships, but we're not in touch with those emotions. So I ask him, is there anything you're angry about? No, he yells at me. Okay, so, okay. The training is non-confrontational. I didn't hold out the red flag again. I didn't say, look, obviously you're angry. But I went a different route. The guy is married. So I start praising women's intuition. My goal was to kind of tiptoe around the mulberry bush and ask the question, what would your wife say if we asked her, is there anything you're angry about? Well, he's a smart guy, and so he figured out where I was going, and before I got to ask the question, he loudly and angrily yelled again, no. So all the other items on the mood scales, and there's hundreds of adjectives, it was all no, no, no. He didn't do any inner work. But there's 3 other people in the training. So we come to the second person, and they didn't get anything out of the first or second word, but they came to the third word, where the computer had a disagreement with their self-report, and the person, you know, they start to cry a little bit, a tear comes out of the eye, and then, okay, well, what's going on here? And then they tell this beautiful story, which is very cathartic, and it's about some traumatic event that happened and the emotions that are cathected to that event. And so it went with each of the other 3 people. Well, this guy, he might not be in touch with his emotions, but he's a good observer of people. So when he comes in on day 2, he's still in his 3-piece, and his white shirt is still too tight at the collar, but he opens his vest, and he takes out a piece of paper, and he unfolds it, and it's a long list. It's all the things and all the people he's angry about. Now, in psychotherapy, this might be year 20. With a good therapist and a good client, maybe year 2. In the training, it's day 2. Okay, so now we give him the following advice. Okay, good work. Go into the chamber now today and get your alpha going. have the tones getting louder. Every 2 minutes the tones stop and scores light up on the computer monitor, where bigger scores are more energy. And there's a color coding. Like if you didn't do better, it's light blue. If you did better, it's dark blue. If you got the best score of the day, that number turns green. So you can get like 6 greens at once. So get your numbers going up, get the tones louder, and then bring to mind somebody from your angry list. Well, he does that. And what happens? He gets angry. And the tones get quieter. And the scores go down. And he goes, well, what's wrong? Oh, what'd they say? Oh, forgiveness. I'm not going to forgive that son of a gun. And he gets angrier. And it gets real quiet in the chamber. And the scores go down to 2 digits. So now he's failing. I mean, CEOs of billion-dollar companies want the numbers to go up, not down. And so he's trapped. He can either hang on to his justified anger and fail, or he can try something different. And so he tries something different. He tries grudgingly, reluctantly, and angrily to do forgiveness. Well, guess what? It stays quiet in the chamber. You don't get points for trying. You only get points for succeeding. And so he sees that's not working, so he tries something else. He changes his attitude. He tries something else. And maybe the 27th thing that he tries, there's a little blub, 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 blub. Oh, what was that? What did I do? Oh, and then he goes back and he remembers what he just did. He remembers the attitude. He remembers the thought form. And he does that for a full 2 minutes. The tones are loud and all his scores turn green. Well, this guy has now become Superman, because now he can go very quickly through a lifetime of grudges and grievances and get rid of all that garbage and forgive it. At one point, George Gallup did a poll on the topic of forgiveness 3-4 years ago. And although it was done in America, a largely Christian audience, 80% of the people surveyed said they felt forgiveness was very important. Of those 80% who said it was very important, 85% of them said they couldn't do it on their own. They needed some outside help, God's help, whatever. Even prayer did not correlate with people's experience of forgiveness. There was only one thing that correlated with the experience of effective forgiveness. That was meditative prayer. Well, when I hear meditative anything, guess what I see? I see alpha waves. Okay? So if people can, in fact, increase their alpha waves, they can discover what is their forgiveness tool. And that is a major theme of the training. Using the junk that's turned up by the mood scale, the psychic mood scale, which will reveal the things that you're guilty about, you're angry about, you're afraid of, you're sad about, and bring that up into the light, and then you can go to those events, those instances, and do forgiveness. Let me give you an example of how powerful this can be. We had a guy in training. He'd been COO and CEO of a number of mid-sized companies, a brilliant career. But for the past 3 years, he'd been in a tailspin. Nothing was working for him. And so he was COO of a company. He was sent by his CEO, the owner of the company. And so on the first day, I mean, he's a warm, friendly kind of guy, and he genuinely worked with the items on the mood scale. He wasn't in general denial. But the word shaky came up, and morning and afternoon mood scale, and it was denied. But the computer wasn't buying it. It was giving him 3, 4 sigmas. So I asked him about it, and no, he said, that's shaky, and he held out his hand. It was rock solid. I'm not shaky. And because he honestly and genuinely worked with all the other words, I let him slide. Okay, day 2. He comes in, again, shaky, morning and afternoon mood scale. Denied, he puts 0. And when I asked him about it this time in the interview, he gets a little irritated. He goes, look, that's shaky. I'm not shaky. Okay, and I said, well, but it's come up 4 out of 4 times. So my intuition is there's something here. And what I recommend you do is, because shaky is kind of a body thing, my intuition is that you should take a soak in a hot tub of water for at least a half an hour before you come into the training tomorrow. Well, day 3, and he didn't do the soak, and he comes in, and shaky appears again on the morning and afternoon mood scale. And this time, when I asked him about it, he yelled at me, shook his finger, and told me in a loud, angry voice, don't ask me about shaky anymore. Well, I mean, that is like waving a red flag in front of a bull. Now, I know there's something there. It's not just an accident. But I didn't push. We went all the way through everything, and he was just going out the door and leaving for the next day. And then in my sweetest voice, I said, now how many more times would shaky have to show up on your mood scales before I would have your permission to ask you about it? Well, the gentleness of the approach got to him, and he shrugged his shoulders, and he goes, well, what do you think? And I go, well, this is your life, not mine. But he said, you got any ideas? I said, well, have the events of the last 3 years shaken you to your very core? And he goes, yeah, they have. And I said, well, that's a start, but it's too general. This is going to be something really specific. Now, I want you to be sure before you come in tomorrow that you take a long soak in a tub of hot water. Get your body really relaxed. So he does. In the morning, after breakfast, he goes out and shoots baskets for a while. And then he comes in into a big tub of water, and he's lying there, and it's like 20 minutes, and it's 30 minutes. And then in about 45 minutes, he like kind of opens one eye, and the surface of the water is just rippling like that. Well, that has him kind of alarmed, because as far as he's concerned, he's lying perfectly still in this tub of water. So he kind of sits up, and there under the water, all by itself, his right hand is going just like that, stirring up the water in the tub. And that was a releasing mechanism, given the forgiveness work that he had done already. It was a releasing mechanism that released back into his consciousness a long repressed trauma. When he was 6, he and his 5 siblings were cared for by a beloved grandma. The parents worked outside the home. And he had gone on and on about this grandma. Oh, the greatest grandma there ever was, next to the Virgin Mary practically. She was so saintly and so holy. Well, when he was 6, beloved Granny had a stroke. And she became, guess what? Shaky. She also had a personality change, where she was now cursing, using words nobody even knew she knew. And she was hitting and kicking the children. And the last time he saw her, she was being dragged out the kitchen door, kicking and screaming and cursing. And he never saw his grandma again. And whenever he went to ask his parents about it, they would rather roughly shut him up. And so this was buried in him. Now, with the benefit of the forgiveness work, once this had come up, and he later said, if I'd been asked to list the 10 greatest traumas in my life, that wouldn't even have been on the list because it was so deeply buried. So then he had some forgiveness work to do. First of all, naturally, he forgave his granny for becoming this mean, vicious hag who was cursing and hitting and kicking the children. Secondly, he forgave his parents for being rough and mean with him every time he would bring up the topic. But the big one, the one that was the most powerful for him, was when he forgave himself for no longer being able to love her. And when he healed that, he was transformed. And his CEO said, he's back. He's his old self again. He was completely healed of all the trauma that had been undermining his performance. There's another story, this one from a professional athlete. The guy was a football player. He had been to 2 Super Bowls. He showed me the huge diamond-encrusted gold rings that they give to people who've been to the football, a Super Bowl game. Now, this guy was so famous that if you mentioned his jersey number to any grocery clerk in the San Francisco Bay Area, they would know his name. He was so famous. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there was this huge drug problem that came up. And he's quietly eased off the team. They didn't want to make a scene about it, but he's off the team because of this drug problem. That he'd never had a drug problem. It literally came out of nowhere. Okay, so now he's in the training. He's no longer on the team. Former Super Bowl, 2-time Super Bowl athlete. And he's doing his work. Well, the mood scales, what they brought up was a story when his father was a traveling salesman, never home. One day when he was 8 years old, he was in the Little League, his father was home on a Saturday, and he went to the game with his son. And the son got a hit, he got on first base, and the father was cheering wildly, and the guy was just in seventh heaven. And then there was a pitch, and the father thought he should have stolen second base, and he didn't. And the father got mad at him. screamed at him, yelled, humiliated him, stomped off the field, jumped into his car, squealed the tires, and drove off. And on the way home, he was killed in an auto accident. Okay, so here's this guy who's just been to 2 Super Bowls, and from his past comes this voice. You don't deserve this, all this fame. You're such a terrible athlete. You killed your father. If you would have stolen second base, your father would be alive today. You don't deserve this. And so he had to engage in the behaviors that would respond to this inner voice. And so he got into drugs, and he got shoved off the team. So guess what? He no longer had the fame that he, quote, didn't deserve. So in the training, he was able to forgive himself. The forgiveness was really beautiful, because it was on day 5 when we saw the pattern that's associated with the perception of angels, or generically astral plane beings. He hadn't shown this pattern in the first 4 days. He didn't show it at the start of the 5th day, but halfway through the training session on the 5th day, his brainwave patterns changed, and the pattern that's associated with the perception of angels appeared. And the technician that I was working with was, marveling at this, and I said, you mark my words, when he comes out of the chamber, he's going to have quite a story to tell. Well, I can't say when he came out of the chamber that he was white as a sheet, because he was a big black guy. But he was one pale, shaking black guy. And it took almost half an hour of coaxing and kind of making it okay for him to talk about whatever had happened before this story tumbled out. And in fact, 3 angels had appeared in the chamber, and he now felt healed and absolved of the guilt of having killed his father by being such a bad athlete. So it was kind of like a reward for the work that he had done. So it's really important to have these computerized mood scales. The value of the so-called psychic insights, if the trainer can know what a person is really thinking, what's really going on in their head, rather than just what they report, you have a tremendous advantage in being able to coach that person. Okay, now in terms of, let's see, overview. The benefits of the ancient wisdom are made vibrantly real and personal in your life when you quiet your mind and open your heart. However, exhortation and meditation are both very slow routes to these attainments. We know the technology speed things up. You can walk to New York, but it's a lot faster and safer to take an airplane. Now, Biocybernaut has an optimized technology for spiritual growth and optimal function, offering many of the attainments of 21 to 40 years of meditation in a 7-day neurofeedback intensive during 7 consecutive days, which can be 10 to 12. We had one training last month. On the last day, the people stayed 17 hours. Using technology and methodology so unique they are patented, Biocybernaut trainees, guided by skilled trainers, go on an inner voyage of ethical cleansing and deep forgiveness work that resolves inner conflicts and thus enables optimal function. Actability. Enacting the steps of this process, including the forgiveness work, enables a profound degree of non-attachment, joy, peace, love, and delight. Conflicts resolve and dissolve. We can talk about that later. We've actually done this for couples counseling. People with non-negotiable demands headed for messy divorces can in fact restore the love that they once felt for each other. The natural results: Biocybernaut training brings spiritual growth through ethical cleansing and inner harmony through improvements in personality, moods, creativity, and compassion. Joy replaces anger and fear, and in this, people thrive. One of my favorite quotes from Chardin is that joy is the most infallible sign of the indwelling of the spirit. And in fact, one of the hierarchy of emotions that we use in the training is there's 5 steps. At the bottom is apathy. Above that is sadness and depression. Above that is anger. Above that is fear. And above that is joy. And the way the model works is if somebody's sad, that's what they present with, that means there's unacknowledged and unexpressed anger. And so if that can come out and get healed, sadness goes away. So It's apathy, sadness, depression, anger, fear, and joy, which is why I tell people, if you're in touch with what you're afraid of, exploring in the safety of the chamber into your deepest fears is always going to be your fastest growth path, because right above fear is joy. I'm not suggesting if you're afraid of heights that you go, climb a bridge, but if you, in the safety of the chamber, imagine that you're climbing a bridge or walking a tightrope, you can, in fact, master those fears. Okay, let's an overview. The requirements of the technology are that the feedback must be immediate, accurate, and aesthetic. In fact, we've even patented the delivery of the feedback within 350 milliseconds of the brain event. If the kid gets into the cookie jar and you don't discover it for 2 weeks, when you discover it, it's the wrong time to discipline the child. Whereas if the hand is in the cookie jar and you come in at that moment, then you get very, very effective learning. So the feedback has to be immediate. It has to be accurate. One of the things that my undergraduate work in physics enabled me to do was to know how to analyze and build accurate filters. When we looked at the most accurate filter of the equipment that is out there in the marketplace, which we don't buy because we can't get accurate enough stuff in the marketplace, we have to build it ourselves. Give you one example. If you were doing Theta training, it's one of the advanced trainings we do, if you had 100 microvolt alpha, which is pretty good alpha, and you had 5 microvolt theta, which is reasonable theta, the amount of alpha leaking into the theta filter would be about 17 microvolts. The real theta is 5 microvolts. The amount of leakage is 17. So the contamination or the inaccuracy is more than 3 times the actual signal. So under those circumstances, you cannot do accurate feedback because the contaminant exceeds by more than 3 times the actual signal. And then the feedback needs to be reasonably aesthetic. Let's say you want to teach somebody to smile. If the corners of their lips turn up, you don't slap them because that feedback extinguishes the response. The feedback needs to be reasonably aesthetic, which is why we've gone to the trouble to build in musical tone so that your brainwaves you can hear as flutes and oboes and organs, and in some of the advanced trainings where you have more channels, then we have saxophones and violins and a synthesizer voice called mystic choir, so that you have an aesthetically pleasing experience when the alpha goes up or the theta goes up or whatever it is that you're training. So the technology needs to be immediate, it needs to be accurate, it needs to be aesthetic. And then in terms of the method, for the method, of course, you need an ergonomic technology. You need an optimized methodology. Now, most people doing brainwave feedback follow the psychotherapeutic model, which is, what is the psychotherapeutic model? Come in maybe twice a month for a 50-minute hour. Or if it's going to be intensive therapy, maybe you come in 1 day a week for a 50-minute hour. Well, there are 2 different strategies, 2 different types of learning. One's called massed practice and one's called distributed practice. One time my father played every Western instrument. He was a band and choir director, and I wanted to learn to play the oboe. And he came and he said, well, to play the oboe you're going to have to practice 8 hours a day for 2 years. Well, I knew that wasn't going to work, and he knew that wasn't going to work. And so I said, well, how about 2 hours a day for 8 years? And he kind of grumbled. But in point of fact, some things you can learn a little bit at a time if you do it regularly. But let me give you an example. We're talking about transformation here, not incremental learning. Most of you have had the experience of taking off in an airplane. And you know that if that airplane taxied 100 feet and stopped, and then taxied another 100 feet and stopped, and so on, you'd get to the end of the runway and this transformation we call flight would not have happened. And that's the way it is, the way most people do neurofeedback. Because if you, in any kind of spiritual growth, what you are engaged in is a struggle with your ego. The ego is the adversary of spiritual growth, and it's described in eloquent ways in every spiritual tradition. the inner adversary. In Zen, they talk about the 5 hindrances: doubt, drowsiness, distractibility and worry, aversion or ill will, and boredom. And they know that if any one of these comes up when somebody's trying to meditate, this is the ego trying to distract them. Because the truth is that when you go into profound altered states, the ego has to be left behind. And so it will tell you lies, like this doorway opens and you're about to go through, like the feast at the kingdom, and the ego will say, if you go through that doorway, you'll die. Well, in fact, you're going to experience temporary, emphasis temporary, ego death when you go into a transcendent state. And the ego hates that. Ram Dass gave a beautiful metaphor for the ego. He said the ego is like the carriage driver. It sits up on the carriage, and it wears this beautiful polished brim hat and has this uniform with polished buttons, and in hands it's got the reins of the senses, and it's used to being in control of you. And when it says giddy up, your body goes, and when the ego says whoa, your body stops. And most people have been through their entire life with their ego thinking it's in control. Then one day, the girl or the boy inside the carriage says to that driver, hey baby, you work for me. And you use my energy that I bring through from source, and from now on, you're going to do it my way. And the ego goes, well, we'll see about that. And then you get this struggle between the ego and the higher self, which is of mythic proportions and which is described in a lot of the spiritual literature. And so in Zen, thousands of years of practice, they recognize that the 5 hindrances are doubt, drowsiness, distractibility and worry, any form of aversion or ill will, and boredom. And when any of these come up, ego is in charge. And so when people are in the training, we teach them the 5 hindrances, and we show them how, well, like thoughts, for example. When you have a thought, it doesn't arise like Venus on the half shell. It's assembled in stages, and kind of like a cereal factory. Let's say you have a cereal factory, and you have like Wheaties going down one line, you have Total on the other. In Total, they're going to brag on the box that it contains 100% of all the vitamins and minerals you need. Well, the ingredients don't have that, so at some point they have to spray on some vitamins. It's a bad way to put vitamins because, it oxidizes and doesn't last very long, short shelf life. But in fact, the vitamins are sprayed on at a certain point in the manufacturing process. And so one of the things that you learn when you're interacting with these tones is that egoicity is something that's added or not added to your thoughts as they generate. For example, if you're sitting there and you hear lots of tones and you have a thought, gee, I'm doing pretty good. Immediately it gets quiet for 2 reasons. 1, it was a conceptual thought, and 2, you took pride in it. Pride was one of the 7 deadly sins for the medieval Catholic Church. And so pride goeth before a fall. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Zen master or not. If pride comes up, your alpha is going to go down. And so then with a little practice, you learn to go, well, she's doing pretty good, or, well, he's doing pretty good. And you withhold that step of identifying the he or the she with you. And with practice, you can get pretty good at that. So what you learn how to do is to have thoughts which are not so conceptual and which are relatively lacking in ego. And this increases your ability to relate well to others. People will find you charismatic and entertaining and lovable in ways that you haven't been with more ego in your thoughts. And so it's part of the process in the optimized methodology to have training that goes long each day and on consecutive days. We find that even taking a day off is a huge setback. And it's kind of like, if you forgive a war metaphor, if you have 2 opposing armies and one of them has a breakthrough and they conquer a bunch of territory and then they withdraw for a day or 2 or 3. When they come back, the opposing army has brought in reinforcements, and that's exactly what the ego does. If you do something and you have a breakthrough into transcendent consciousness and you don't immediately follow it up the next day, when you come back, there's no doorway there anymore. It's all been walled up, bricked over, because the ego is defending its territory. And then the final one is transformational perspective of the trainer. Not everyone can be a trainer for this process. It requires a lot of joy. It requires a lot of mental flexibility. If somebody walks in looking like death warmed over, you have to see them as a radiant being filled with light and speak to them as though that's who they really are. And pretty soon the story, the sad story they're telling, they're falling on deaf ears, and they start to speak from a more joyful place. And you have to be a trainer, you have to be passionately interested in the details of other people's experience. So that if somebody goes into the chamber, has an experience, and comes out, tells you the story, particularly if it's some theme which, if pursued, would lead them quickly to deeper levels of the training, you want to go back and ask to hear that story again. And details that were unmentioned and would have been forgotten if they weren't asked about and mentioned, they will come out. And so the people begin to teach themselves. You know, you can't tell people, like if you were going to go to a grocery store, I say, well, where's the nearest grocery store? You know, you would go out, you turn right, you go to the light, left and down, and you'll see it there. Well, you can't do that for higher consciousness. There's no roadmap in the same way. And so you have to work with intuition, you have to work with feelings, and when somebody says something, like I can remember one woman, and when she got alpha, she goes, "Oh my God, it's so easy. I simply go away from my eyes." And the other people looked at her like, well, what? But I understood. This woman, when she came in, she had some of the highest levels of muscle tension I'd ever seen in the frontalis muscle. So when she relaxed that muscle tension, that was a part of a pattern in which she took energy away from trying to see. There's a difference between looking and trying to see. And seeing is even different still. So it made sense for her. And so sometimes the words that people use are very idiosyncratic, but they often contain a deep kernel of truth. The trainer needs to be able to pick that up and kind of dust it off and give it back to them as a polished gem, which is the insight that they just had, stripped away with some of the idiosyncratic aspects of it. Okay, how does Biocybernaut training blend and achieve alpha or theta, the depth interviews, forgiveness, spiritual growth, and optimal function? Well, let's go back to the Einstein quote. Problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them. The applications, in general, neurofeedback is effective at moving people from dysfunction toward hyperfunction. Now, if people come in they're a basket case, I'm not going to promise you that in 7 days we can have them up here. But we can, in fact, bring them up into the middle range. At one point when I was at the university, UCSF, I went to San Francisco State with the help of the Dean of Students, and I leafleted the campus, and I gave personality tests to close to 200 students and selected 20, the top and bottom, most and least anxious people. Then I brought them in and gave them the training called the Extreme Groups Design. Well, the people who were in the high anxiety group, it was the first factor of the MMPI. The MMPI is kind of the granddaddy of personality tests. And it's real good at discriminating among different kinds of dysfunction. Like it can tell schizophrenia from paranoia. It can tell paranoia from depression. It can tell depression from anxiety. It's real good at discriminating among dysfunction. It can't really do well in discriminating among different kinds of hyperfunction, but at this end, the MMPI is very good. Okay, so at the end of the training, I took the MMPI and had the people do the MMPI again. They actually did it twice before and once after. And I took these MMPIs to a psychologist. Her name was Maureen O'Sullivan, and she worked with patients on the locked wards of Langley Porter, where people are picked up by the police, they've been engaged in violent or, harming others, harming themselves, and they're brought into Langley Porter and locked up and sedated with heavy drugs. She looked at some of these MMPIs from the students from San Francisco State, and she said, "Where did you find these people? These people are as bad as the ones we've got on the locked wards." This was the top 10% of the first factor of the MMPI. And in fact, I was a grad student, it was part of my doctoral work, and missing data is a real no-no. It makes the statistics really hard. So if somebody didn't show up for their session, I would get on my motorcycle and I would go to wherever they lived and pick them up and bring them in for their session. And for this one guy who was very high on schizophrenia, when I got to his room, it was a rented room out on the avenues near the ocean, there were 3 pieces of furniture in the room. There was a big mattress in the corner, there was an orange crate that served as a chair, and there was a desk. And he was on the mattress in the corner of the room with his knees pulled up to his chest, his arms around, and he was just rocking back and forth. Very autistic, very, very highly schizophrenic. Now, at the end of the training, when they had done the training, 7 days, they took the MMPIs again, Maureen O'Sullivan is looking at these, she say, I can't believe these are the same people. The personalities were so profoundly transformed. In fact, I now look at personality kind of like an operating system. And if you've got a computer, you can load Windows, or DOS, or Unix, or Linux, or any of a number of different operating systems that can run on that hardware. And depending on the operating system that you have loaded, your hardware will perform differently. And so if somebody has a program loaded, which is paranoid schizophrenic, they will have certain patterns of brainwaves. And by learning to change those patterns of brainwaves, their personality, their core personality, will be transformed. Now, to give you an idea how radical this is, when I was in the Department of Psychiatry at UCSF, our chairman decreed that we were going to have an annual faculty retreat. Okay, so the whole faculty showed up at this retreat center for a 2-day retreat, Saturday and Sunday. And every faculty member, I was one of them, had to stand up and give a 10-minute description of my work. So I had gotten about 5 minutes in, and I was talking about, I showed some slides of MMPI profiles before and after the training, and there were 3 psychiatrists who jumped out of their seats. They were practically foaming at the mouth. They were angry and they were shouting. They were incredibly threatened by the fact that this young whippersnapper was talking about changing core dimensions of personality, which in their experience could, with 20 or 30 years of psychotherapy, maybe be tinkered with a little bit at the margin. But let's not talk about changing fundamental dimensions of personality. That's threatening to the whole field of psychiatry. And so it was. I never went to another faculty retreat. But in fact, it's possible to profoundly change dimensions of personality. And depending where on the head you increase your alpha, you will affect different dimensions of personality, which is one of the reasons why even in the basic training that we give, the alpha training, we give feedback simultaneously from 4 sites with a separate tone for each one and a separate score so people can choose where they want to increase their alpha. Now, the hyperfunction is well, let's look at some of the details here. Some of the things that we can do in dysfunction. We can do conflict resolution. We can do alcohol and drug abuse treatment programs. We can treat chronic pain. In geriatrics, we can take people in their 70s and 80s. At one time, we had a couple. The woman was 87 and her boyfriend was 88. And on the 5th day, when they came out of the chamber, they were feeling so good, they held hands and they danced around in a circle like this, singing. And he was threatening to throw her over his shoulder and run up and down the stairs with her. And I said, I don't think our insurance would cover that. Would you wait until you get home, please? So there's an amazing amount of plasticity in the older organism that can be brought forth simply by having the right brainwaves. Everybody in the federal grant, we were working with ladies from 60 up into their 80s, everybody who had high blood pressure, when their alpha went up, their blood pressure went down. We've also worked with people who are post-op for a bypass surgery on heavy meds who were able to throw away their medication, their blood pressure medication, by doing this training. Stress reduction, stress management, personality therapy, anxiety, attention deficit disorder, all of these and more kinds of dysfunction can be effectively treated by changing your brainwaves. Now, on the other end of the scale, hyperfunction, we have meditation and spiritual development. We can take people in 7 days and teach them how to have the brainwaves and the experiences which would take them over 20 years in daily practice of a meditation tradition like Zen. In corporate optimal function programs, in athletic peak performance, in creativity enhancement. I told you about the study with Stanford Research Institute scientists, where we increased, on average, their creativity by 50%. IQ boosting. In 1998, we were hired by a company to bring the technology to another state. We moved it, and for 7 months, we trained all of their shareholders, top people in their company, and some of their families. Everyone, and they ranged in age from 10 to 64, everybody did the Kaufman adolescent and adult IQ test before the training, and then they repeated it an average of 4 months after their initial training. The average increase in IQ was almost 12 points, and it worked equally well for people across the entire age range. So we can raise creativity, we can raise IQ, education and mastery, entertainment, virtual reality. There's a poem by Khalil Gibran in which he says, near the end of the poem, he said, "What man would not burn his heart as incense before a God that listened to his prayers and granted him his desires?" Now, Hollywood recently has begun moving in the direction, with the help of Silicon Valley, of having interactive entertainment. How many times have you gone to a movie and at the critical scene, you know, whether it's boy meets girl or whatever, and the scriptwriter has them go in some direction that you don't want, and so you're not pleased with that form of entertainment. Now, if your brainwaves were monitored and you're looking at a virtual reality kind of entertainment, the computer could be programmed to read your desires so that the plot would unfold in ways which would maximize your joy, your happiness, and your satisfaction. So it would be kind of like the holodeck on Star Trek, with the exception that it would be real-time interactive with your desires. So a huge application for entertainment here. We can also do research into brain, mind, being functions. And then there are transcendent uses like shared feedback. I'll say just a little bit about shared feedback. In flying, you never would solo first. If you were learning to fly an airplane, soloing is something you do after you've trained with an instructor. Well, in brainwave training, you solo first. You go into the chambers by yourself so that all of the sounds that you hear, you know are coming from you. The first, I mean, we jokingly call day one disorientation day because it's so unfamiliar that most people are just lost. They don't have a clue as to what to do to make these tones come and go. That develops over time. And so you don't want to train with somebody else, because if some of the tones, you know, were this person here and some of the tones were this person here, you'd have the additional problem of sorting it out. So initially, you solo. But once you learn how to do the basic training, then you can go into the chamber with someone else. Now, I've never had the opportunity to do this, but I assure you that when a quarterback on a football team is standing there being protected by the guards while the wide receiver is sprinting 45 yards down the field and turns around and the ball is right there, those two guys have synchronized brainwaves. I can assure you of that. Now, some days it works and some days it doesn't. They could use this form of training to be in greater rapport. In fact, the basis of rapport is synchronized brainwaves. There was a study done by Grinberg-Zilberbaum in Mexico City at a research institute. And what he did was he went out onto the streets and he collared strangers, paid them a few pesos, brought them into his lab, wired them for electrodes, and sat them down in chairs where their heads were close together. These are their noses, okay? So they're facing away from each other, and their heads are fairly close. And he gave each one of them a silent button to push in their lab. Simple instructions: close your eyes, sit there. When you feel a sense of rapport with this stranger behind you, push the button. That's it. And then he started the polygraph, so brainwaves are being written out, and there were little marker channels that would show when the buttons were pushed. Well, the button pushes were just about simultaneous. And they occurred when the brainwaves of the people had, in that moment, synchronized. So when we talk about rapport, there is a physiological underpinning to that between those two people. And they can be a foot apart, they can be 1,000 miles apart. And when their brainwaves go into synchrony, they will feel a connection. I would submit that other characteristics like presence or poise or majesty or charisma all have underlying patterns of brainwaves, which are measurable and, guess what, trainable. Now, in business, emotions, by and large, are outlawed. You are required by most businesses to leave your emotions at home. Don't bring your emotions to work. It might even be in the company guidelines. Well, the reason for that is most people are so out of control about their emotions that the only way not to have all this disruption is to just bar all emotions. Well, just like there's IQ, there's also EQ, or emotional intelligence. And if the whole person could come to work, they could be way more effective. And so when people have training like this, where they learn to get in control of their emotions by learning to control the brain waves that underlie their emotions, all of a sudden a richer, fuller person shows up to work. One of the studies that I would love to do sometime is to find two companies that between the two of them pretty much dominate their field equally, and then give all of the people in one company a week of this training. Now, I would guess that 2 years later, Company B isn't even going to be around, because Company A, the people are going to be 50% more creative. They're going to have an average increase in IQ of almost 12 points. They're going to be bringing their full emotional skill set to work, and they're going to be more motivated. They're going to be more happy. They're going to be filled with joy, and that will demonstrate to companies the importance of having this kind of training. Very few companies would attempt to do business now without a computer. 100 years ago, they didn't think of using a computer. But it's become a matter of fact. You have to have it. And so in the future, will this training become essential? Biocybernaut know-how, it's expanding neurofeedback with computerized mood scales, forgiveness, letting go, which is non-attachment, replacing conflict with compassion, opening your heart. Increase in spirituality leads to increase of optimal functioning. I see Jordan standing here, so we must be almost out of time. There are yet to come, and I'll stay as long as anyone wants to, but we will perhaps wrap things up. Stories of spiritual adventures and optimal function. And among the stories that I would delight in sharing with you are about creative artists. The San Francisco 49er, I already told you, but there's 20 years of TM, Pregnant Team, Walking with Jesus, and Muktananda. So we'll come back to those possibly. I want to make invitations. You are invited to participate in the Alpha 1 training or the more than 12 advanced trainings. There are also licensing opportunities, opportunities to collaborate in research, and to join the Biocybernaut team. Recall, Einstein said problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them, and I'm proposing that we teach people how to have increased awareness. And so I thank you very much for being here and for your rapt attention.
Would you like to take questions? Mm-hmm. Dr. Hardt would like to take questions if any of you have any. And if you would, I would enjoy it if you come to this, prefer it if you come to this microphone, please, so we can capture it for the recording.
I'd just like to know if you're working children.
Yes. The youngest children that we work with in this program is 8. Now, we do recommend that children between 8 and 12 come with at least one parent. In one exception, we had a 10-year-old and his 12-year-old sister, and that seemed to work well. And there are a number of reasons for that. You're perhaps familiar with the famous French developmental psychologist, Jean Piaget, who described the development of intelligence as having 4 main stages. The 4th stage, which is formal operational intelligence, doesn't develop until around age 7. And one interesting thing that characterizes the development of formal operational intelligence if you have two people, if you're sitting here and there's a 5-year-old child sitting here, and you give the child a piece of paper and a pencil and ask them to draw what you are seeing, the child will not turn around and look at what you're seeing. The child will in fact draw what it's seeing. It can't take a perspective of another person in a systematic way. And a lot of this training involves taking a perspective on yourself. Now, one of the things that we find is that when parents come with their children is a remarkable healing of the child-parent relationship. One example was a father who father had ADD. He was a brilliant computer programmer, and he brought his 9-year-old son, who also had ADD and was being maintained on Ritalin. And as you know, children with ADD can be very disruptive. So it was probably day 4 or 5, and we were reviewing at the end of the day the father's mood scales, and there was a lot of sadness there. And so I'm asking him, which he had denied, but the computer detected that he was sad. And so I'm asking him, what are you sad about? And he described the problems that he had had that morning getting his son to get dressed and brush his teeth and comb his hair. And the child is for the first time looking at his father and realizing that his behavior is having a painful emotional effect on his father. It totally changed that child's life, and it changed the relationship between the child and the father. And the child became much more responsible, realizing that his actions, in fact, were hurting or not hurting his beloved father. There's actually an interesting a sequel to that. Later that summer, the child's family was spending time at a mountain lake. And there was a big floating island out in the middle of the lake, an inflatable island. And the child was on the island when the island was being towed by a motorboat back to shore. Well, unbeknownst to the driver of the motorboat, the child fell off and became trapped underneath the island, which had, mountains and, different kinds of shapes and so on. And he was starting to drown. And rather than freaking out, he went into an alpha state, consciously. And when that happened, and I know about this because he begged his parents for 2 days to let him call me to tell him what happened. And they, oh, no, don't bother Dr. Hardt like that. Finally, they let him call. What had happened was an angel had appeared to him and had guided him out from under the floating island into the surface of the water. He was no longer on Ritalin. When he went back to school that fall, I had stories that he had befriended a couple of the bullies in school, and he was now teaching them how to meditate. Not a result you get when you do beta training, which is what most people do for ADD. We do alpha training, which takes people to a deeper level. But they do need to be, we recommend, at least 8 years old. Hi.
I want to know if you've ever had any failures in helping people who cannot forgive themselves or if I would be the first.
Well,
That's the only reason I wouldn't go right tomorrow and do this, is that I just have too much failure with not being able
to forgive.
I was a creative musician and singer and dancer and this and that from the time I was 0, and because of 13 years of shock and grief and abandonment and so on, I couldn't deal with it, and I know it's forgiveness, and I can't do it. I'm afraid that this would fail too.
Well, we've never had a forgiveness failure if people make the effort to do the work. And let me give you an example, kind of like an extreme case. One time, we had a woman in training whose father had been and was a Ku Klux Klan leader. When this woman was 3 years old, the father began raping her ritualistically as part of the Klan meetings, and he had all the other members of the Klan rape and beat her. He would also do things like, they lived near the train tracks, and he would take her down when there was a train coming and make her lie down between the tracks. And the train would come and over her. And when it was gone, he would go and he would feel her panties. And if in terror she had in the slightest little bit wet her panties, there would be more beatings. Now, this abuse continued until she was 15, when she had the courage to run away from home. The father was unrepentant, pursued her, found out through relatives where she was, and would threateningly call and so on, threatening her with more abuse. And when I proposed to her that she forgive him, she screamed at me, "He doesn't deserve my forgiveness." She just exploded. She turned, practically purple with rage. And that was one of her concerns. She had this volcanic reservoir of anger, and she was afraid even to go shopping, because if this sweet old lady maybe bumped her car, she thought maybe erupt out of the car and strangle the lady when this anger blew up. So I waited until she calmed down a little bit, and I said, well, I'm not suggesting you tell him that you forgive him. In fact, I probably would suggest that you don't tell him. And you're not forgiving him for him, you're forgiving him for you. You're forgiving him for you. Because look at what you just did, this anger. You released all this adrenaline, all this cortisol. These are poisonous chemicals. They're circulating through your body. They're going to be there for days until they're fully cleared. So I would like to ask you to forgive him for you and not tell him. And now, I should mention that this woman, because of the abuse, had fractionated into 12 alters. She was a multiple personality. So when the abuse would happen, a boy would show up to take the abuse or whatever. In the course of the week, she coalesced back into a single person. And for some years afterwards, she would call me on Mother's Day to say thank you, saying that I had given birth to the unitary person that she was. Very good question.
Well, I want to show a little bit of linear thinking here and ask what the cost is for your 7-day session.
Good question. The cost is $1,500 per day. The days are 10 to 12 and sometimes longer. So on an hourly basis, it's about $120, $130 an hour. We do 7-day programs. So the cost is $10,500. Now, if you come with someone else, there is a 10% discount if you bring 1 or 2 people with you. And one of the things that happened to me in meditation this morning was that I was given guidance to offer this group here this evening a 2-for-1 special. So if 2 people want to come out of this group, you can bring someone. It would be, for this group only, it would be a 2-for-1 special. Yes, we do. In fact, the 74-year-old lady that I showed you the brainwaves of put $1,000 down, and she's paying about $500 a month for several years.
I think you mentioned this morning in Jeff's program that you work with stroke victims.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on that? And the work you've done with other so-called cognitive impairments?
Probably one of the most challenging stroke patients that we worked with was a woman who had had a stroke that rendered her mostly paralyzed on the upper left side. She could walk, kind of dragging her leg, but the thing that was really the most heartbreaking for her husband was that her personality was gone. It was one of those situations, lights are on, nobody's home. And so she came in for training, and one of the women assistants worked extensively with her. And what would happen was, at the end of the day, because her husband would bring her, drop her off, and then he would leave, and then come back, 7, 8 hours later, and she would be there. And it would be his wife again was back, and she had some movement restored. And by the next morning, there would be, again, some loss of function. And there was an incremental process. It was a situation that I wish had been able to continue for 2 weeks rather than just 1 week. But we got to the point where she knew who she was. She knew her family again. She knew her husband, and when he would come in, they would hug and kiss. It was just incredibly touching. Other kinds of cognitive impairment that we are just starting to work with. There were a few women in the federal grant who had early stage Parkinson's disease, and they experienced a lot of benefit. We hadn't followed up with that until recently, but I've been speaking recently at Parkinson's support groups in the Bay Area. The brainwaves of Parkinson's are very similar to the brainwaves of senility, especially loss of alpha and theta. Now, if there's dementia along with the Parkinson, then it's a delta theta pattern. And so the thing that happens in the course of the training is the brainwaves speed up and the delta goes away, the theta speeds up into alpha, and the intellectual function and a lot of the quality of life is restored. I'm not suggesting that this is a cure for Parkinson's, but it can help ameliorate a lot of the symptoms. And in terms of the aging, the advent of senility or senescence is marked by a loss of alpha and the emergence of the senile brainwave pattern, which is mixed theta and beta. And whenever people replace that with alpha, their psychic drive comes back, their intellectual function comes back, and physically they become, over time, healthier. It's like the brain is this master regulator of the hormonal and the endocrine system, and if the brain is not getting enough oxygen, one of the things that you see is the alpha goes away, but also the brain is also dysregulating major body systems. So one of the, shall we say, side effects of the increased blood flow that brings back the alpha, which is what they're actually training for, is that the brain then has the means to appropriately regulate, as it used to, all of the other bodily functions, some of them being cognitive.
We have one last question.
I see two that want to talk, so.
Quick question, Dr. Thank you. I noticed one of my thoughts was this, your training is so cathartic, it seems. There must be people who have a lot of claims of weight loss and by their problem D, and people in a more balanced state are able to function on less sleep. Is that the case with anybody?
Well, let's do the weight one first. People who are overweight tend to lose weight as a result of the training. However, people who are anorexic tend to gain weight. In fact, at one point, we had a woman in training who was anorexic and bulimic, and she was a granddaughter of the man who started Weight Watchers. And she told horror stories of being dressed by her mother to go see Grandpa. And so she would be dressed in this beautiful outfit, and then mother would start to cry and become hysterical, and oh my God, no, that isn't going to work. And she would rip the clothes off the little girl and dress her in another outfit, equally beautiful. And then, again, that would be repeated. She'd wail and cry and become hysterical, and the little girl developed this like, my God, what's wrong with me? I mean, I can't wear anything and be pleasing to grandfather, who had very, very strict standards about how women ought to look. And so this woman, this little girl, was traumatized. And so as an adult, she's anorexic and bulimic. And so through the course of the training, she was able to be healed of that very, very deep trauma. Could you re-ask the question? I've lost the second part of it.
The question was sleep, functioning with less sleep in a higher functioning state.
We recommend that people get more sleep than usual to do the training. I cite, typically, a study that was done whereby ordinary Americans in a variety of jobs were measured during a 2-week period. They were given mood scales, not the computerized mood scales we use, but just paper and pencil, describe your moods. And they had jobs where their performance could be quantified on a daily basis. And so for a 2-week period prior to the study, their moods were measured every day, and their performance at work was measured every day. Then one thing was changed. They were required to sleep in a soundproof chamber, and they were, which was completely dark, completely quiet, and they were required to spend 10 hours a night in bed. Even people who swore that they couldn't sleep more than 6 hours, everybody slept at least 9. Okay? And there were huge drops in the negative moods, and there were large increases in their performance. So sleep tends to really help with alpha. As I mentioned in the 5 hindrances from Zen, drowsiness is one of the 5 hindrances. And if a person is sleep deprived, the ego has an easier job of getting you to nod off instead of attending to the process of meditation or feedback. Now, what does the feedback do? Well, I'm the kind of person who has always, all the way through grade school and high school and college, I needed 10 hours of sleep to function. Now, there was a period in '99 where we had, again, I mentioned this Mormon group. They had come in and they had pledged $1 million for doing a startup, and they actually put $350,000 in a bank account. We started hiring people, doing technology development. Their money disappeared, and so they had to pull out. But during that period, they had also come to me and said, we know somebody who has $100 million, and they want to do the private equivalent of fractional banking, where they would loan the money out to a company, then sell the note, have the money back, and we were supposed to be number 2 in line. And so the question to me was, could you expand your technology fast enough to pay back a $100 million loan at the end of 3 years? Well, I didn't know the answer to that. And so during the day, I was running this startup, working 18 hours a day, and then I stayed up essentially all night working on the computer with Excel to find out if I could, in fact, train the trainers of trainers fast enough. The rate limiting factor in any expansion of this technology is finding and training the right trainers. And so it turned out, yes, it would only take 12 trainers of trainers, and then they could train all of the people, and in the end of 3 years, there'd be 64 large centers around the country. And in the model, it brought $150 million of profit, so the $100 million loan could be paid off. Well, during that period, I slept not more than 2 hours a night for 6 months, and I was functioning at a very high level. Now, on the eve of Christmas Eve, when a guy called up and said, I've lost all my money offshore, and I'm pulling out, and you don't owe me anything, but I'm not going to put in the money I had promised. Virtually all the staff got laid off. But I also crashed. I had been sustaining on the joy of having my life's work, get out to people who could benefit. And so my body crashed after that. But I can tell you that, a 10-hour have-to sleeper went 6 months with less than 2 hours a night. So I don't recommend it in general, but if the goal is worthy, at least it makes it possible.
I had a stroke in the visual cortex, which has obstructed my vision by 60%. Have you had any experience with anything like that?
Not specifically that type of stroke, but let me describe what I think is the mechanism by which the alpha training heals stroke damage. When a stroke occurs, you will have death of neurons in the region where the brain, where the blood vessels were ruptured. Now, some of the neurons in that area after the stroke are not going to be getting enough blood in order to do their neuron thing. They're not dead, they're still alive, but they're kind of like in hibernation mode. And when through the alpha training you dilate the blood vessels that feed the brain, you all of a sudden are delivering more blood to all regions of the brain, particularly the area where you're training near. And the occipital region, which rules vision, is the 2 of the prime sites where, in most people, that's where they have their most alpha. And so those areas are now getting more blood, and these marginal neurons now all of a sudden switch back on. And so it would be a marvelous study where, if you know that it's 60%, and there are tests of visual acuity that can be done, so we could repeat that afterwards and actually quantify the improvements. what a beautiful question. And I want to say that as you were coming up, Jordan was giving me the, let's wind this up. But really, that question needed to be asked. It's something that I should have addressed. And so for everyone's sake, I'll make this brief. In the federal grant, we had funding to do a 6-month follow-up and a 12-month follow-up. Now, our primary outcome measure there was personality tests. They were easy to administer, they could be computer scored, they were reliable. We could mail them out to people, they could do them at home. It didn't require a lot of overhead. And so we had done the test twice before the training, at least a week apart, and then in the week after. And that's important because with 2 pre-measures and a post, you can detect and, if necessary, statistically correct for any regression to the mean. It makes the change measures much more reliable. Then at 6 months later, we mailed out the forms to people, they filled them out, and that was their ticket to come back and have another session. We did the same thing at 12 months. Now, what we saw was that people who had, say, increased their alpha at C3, that's the site that rules paranoia. When C3 alpha goes up, paranoia goes down. And so people who had increased their alpha occipitally would have seen reductions of schizophrenia and psychasthenia. Anywhere on the head, alpha goes up will reduce anxiety. So what we saw was, immediately after the training, there were these beneficial changes in personality that were related to where on the head and how much the alpha had gone up. When people came back at 6 months, there were further beneficial changes in their personality structure. And at 12 months, there were even more changes of a beneficial nature. So I'm going, well, now that's certainly remarkable that people they're better at 12 months than they are in the week immediately after the training. I didn't really have a model to explain that until I read a report. It was called a meta-analysis. In meta-analysis, what people do is they go out and they gather a number of studies in an area, and then they study the studies. Well, this meta-analysis was done on different types of therapy to see how effective different types of therapy, psychotherapy and so on, were. And what they found was very interesting, that insight-based therapies had the longest-lived results. Immediately, the light bulb went on in my head, because alpha is the mother of insights. You can't have an insight. You can't have a creative breakthrough without having a burst of alpha. So by teaching people how to make alpha, we were giving them access to the wellspring or the mother lode of insights. And the adage, give a man a fish and he eats for a day, teach a man to fish, and not only can he eat for the rest of his life, he can now feed his family and he can feed his whole village. And so what we're doing by teaching people how to make alpha was giving them ongoing access out at least a year to their own wellspring of insights. Now, I don't know how long after the year there would be further improvements. That we haven't studied. But I know at least out to a year, the personality structure is continuing to improve. Now, there's a high that goes along with the training. Everybody who's ever done the training who has done, for example, LSD, has said, usually along about the 5th day, man, this is better than my best acid trip. And so this high, in fact, over time fades. For the Zen Master, he said after about 4 weeks, the high had started to fade. So not all of the aspects of the training, in fact, are continued. And I believe in ongoing training, doing tune-ups. They're not essential. Some people never come back. One guy came back for a 4-day tune-up every 2 years. That was an interesting story. I'd like to tell it briefly. This guy was an electrical engineer, a genius, he had patents, and he'd gotten an MBA from Stanford. He's the only person I've ever met that I would describe as a devout atheist initially. Now, well, what's a devout atheist? This guy not only didn't believe in God, he didn't believe in the existence of anything if he couldn't see it, feel it, sense it in some way. He denied the existence of unconscious thoughts and motivations in himself. Okay, so now he starts the training. On his 5th day, I go into the chamber and I can see he's in some kind of an altered state. So he starts telling me the story of his session. This guy's had an out-of-body experience. He's out of body, he's watching himself make love with a beautiful woman, and he's in a third perspective watching himself watch himself and thinking, man, what a gas. Now, this guy's favorite expression was somebody who wasn't totally logical, was they're off their nut. So I said to him, you know, if I had told you 5 days ago this was possible, you would have said that I was off my nut. And when I said nut, he exploded in laughter and couldn't stop laughing for 10 minutes. Now, every 2 years after that, he would come in. Now, he's brilliant. He's got an MBA from Stanford. He's an electrical engineer. And so when he comes in, he's got headhunters after him, pressing choice job offerings onto him. You know, oh, take my job. Please take my job. And so what he would do, the first 2 days of his tune-up, he would simply, what a sailor would say, get your sea legs back. He would get his alpha going again. Then, on the third day, he would start bringing to mind each one of the job offerings and living it. Okay, let's see, Western Regional Marketing Manager for Hitachi. And he would live out in his mind the kinds of work that he'd be doing, the kinds of travel, the kind of projects he'd be involved in, the kind of people he'd be dealing with, and he'd notice where his scores were ranging. Then he'd set that offering aside, and he'd bring to mind the second job offering and live it out in his imagination. And then he would have them rank ordered. And on the fourth day, he would repeat it. You know, this guy's very logical, so he wants to make sure that it's repeatable. And at the end of the fourth day, before even leaving the lab, he'd pick up the telephone and he'd call the recruiter whose job offering consistently gave him the highest alpha. And his career just went up like that. He's now retired on a big bag of $50 million or something like that. So that's an example of how somebody reliably used the training to get, it's like a high-tech Ouija board, where you're asking yourself, you know, how would I function in a situation like this? And instead of making lists of pros and cons and weighting them, you simply ask your alpha. And I'd like to do one more story there. In the federal grant, before the people started their feedback, they did 3 days of baselines. Now, we had a dozen different baselines: fast breathing, slow breathing, eyes open, eyes closed, sexual fantasy, imagining you're in your own room. Well, as you can imagine, we had a college-age male group that we did to anchor the results. All the pilot data had been done with college-age males. And for the males, the sexual fantasy was always in the top 3 alpha producers, except for this one guy where it was dead last. I mean, in his sexual fantasy, he had less alpha than when he was doing fast breathing or eyes open. Okay? So, you know, at the end of this baseline, I go into the chamber, and, you know, he's holding a mic, and I'm holding a mic, and we're doing the interview. And we go through the interview, we come to the sexual fantasy, and he blushes. And I go, well, you know, if this is too personal, you don't have to tell me. But on the other hand, if you could tell me, I would really learn a lot because of what I saw in the polygraph. So he kind of hems and haws and clears his throat a few times. And then he tells his sexual fantasy. And in his sexual fantasy, he's tied to a bed and he's being beaten. The guy is a masochist. Now, in his mind, that's sexual pleasure. He seeks it out. But what does his alpha do? That's when I coined the expression, you can fool yourself, but you can't fool your alpha. His alpha knew that pain was pain and not pleasure. And so there is deep truth and wisdom in your alpha that transcends what your rational mind can know. And through the technology, you can gain access to that to solve real-world problems.